First of all, just welcome to everyone. We're not going to use a mic tonight. This is a good enough space, and so you should all be able to hear and whatever. For those of you that aren't aware, this has been an exhibition that's been some time in the making, and when we actually opened it the other night, we did start with a welcome to country. I will tonight, then I'll explain what's going to happen. So I'd like to start by paying respect to the traditional and original owners of this land, the Moina people, to pay respect to those that have passed before us, and to acknowledge today's Aboriginal people who are custodians of the land. And with that thought, we'll start. The idea, I was talking to Heather and Michaye, and for those of you that weren't here on opening night, I'll just explain it quickly. In the midst of COVID, Carol called up and she asked to speak to myself and Pete Hay. Pete, pop your hand up. Pete's over the back. And Pete asked, we talked about it, that something strange was happening in Tasmania. I don't know how, the words are around us, but we're in some sort of beautiful bell jar. And Carol thought that the idea was worthy of exploration. And so the idea of this particular painters and poets, or writers and painters, was born. And Pete and I were tasked with the idea of coming up with a curatorial statement, which is down the back. And that was a very scientific process. Hazy suggested that we go to our shack down on Bruny Island. We have a few beers and a couple of red wines, and we get a word. And if we get a word, we probably get a paragraph. And we got one paragraph, we get a couple. And Hazy said the role of the curatorial statement is to be suitably ambiguous so no one really knows what it means and allows maximum scope for interpretation. And it is ambiguous. You could say disappearing question mark, or disappearing upward intonation or downward intonation, I don't know. But tonight is about exploring this with some of our wonderful collaborators. And before we just hear from them, one other little advertisement. Two of our collaborators, Heather and Michaye, have done a beautiful piece of work at the back. Michaye's the artist and Heather's done the writing. And they turned their work into a book, and there are 8 copies. There are 8 copies, of which one has been donated to the exhibition, to Disappearing, that's being auctioned off. It's down the back corner, it's a silent auction, it's been running for the exhibition, and we'll know the winner tonight. So if you'd like to make a bid, talk to either Jack or Carol from the gallery, and they can put in your bid for the book. And it's a beautiful artefact.
Can I just say that the latest bid is $900, so you'll have to do better than that.
There we go, good on you. So just an introduction, and these are, I'll just introduce you so everyone knows who's who. On my left here is Greg Lehman. Greg collaborated with Brigita, and Brigita's is the work just behind Michaye there, which is the moving image, and Greg's is the writing that's beside that, which takes excerpts from a variety of sources. I'll leave you to talk about that, Greg. Leigh, Woolley and Neil Haddon collaborated. This is Neil's piece of work behind me, and Leigh has written his piece that goes with that, reviewing a disappearing townscape. And the last collaborators to introduce are Heather and Michaye, who are multimedia megastars because they're in the magazine on the weekend. And they have produced the piece of work down the back. And what we'll do tonight, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I'll start it off. They'll no doubt bounce off each other, and I'll make some space for people from the audience to ask some questions as well. If you want to ask a question, keep it fairly short. And then we'll pitch it, sort of like QA and Philip Adams rolled in together. There we go. So, let's get started. Oh no, there goes the water. No disaster. And what I want to ask, and I'm going to ask you first, Heather. I told you I'd ask you this first one. Where did you start the journey with your collaboration in response to the idea of disappearing?
Well, we actually got together and had quite a few cups of tea, and we recorded our conversations. And we wanted to see how the collaboration would work and what does collaboration look like between us. So we had a lot of fun having very rich and deep conversations several times. And then what was really interesting in the process was realising that Michaye's work is such an intimate response to landscape. And, you know, there are a lot of sea stories in Tasmania, and there's a lot of sea stories that are personal to me, but I wanted to do something I'd not written about before. So Michaye made up a little book for us, and that really helped. She made this little book and put some words out of the wonderful piece that you and Pete created, and there was something in that moment, wasn't there? We saw this little book and we're like, ooh, that's really interesting. And so then I thought, well, what if I told a really personal story in response to these incredibly personal seascapes that are so evocative and speak about Tasmania so richly to me. So that's where I thought, well, the newest story I have to share is my love of cold water swimming.
And perhaps just to pick up on that, Michaye, how did you respond to the idea of disappearing? What did it trigger in you?
Yeah. Well, like Heather said, we had conversations and we deliberately kept it very open. In fact, we were ranging from, you know, the importance of insects in our, environment to what's the real meaning of progress, which is actually quite a lovely word. It actually means to continue onwards towards appreciation, which I think's, you know, it's gotten kind of reused these days, but its original meaning is really beautiful. But we just still kept coming back to that kind of personal element in a way, and that sense of, for me, what sort of atmosphere you could find that remained in the loss of somebody or something or some place. What was that haunting atmosphere that remained? So that kind of triggered for me enough to go and work. But it could have been a lot of different things.
It could have been a lot of different things. We got very caught on insects for a while. Yeah. Because we've lost over 40% of our insect population. And my inner activist was in full force originally, early on in the process, wasn't it? And I was like, I want to rage about things. But in the end, I decided just to be really subtle and let people take from it what they take from it. But, yeah.
Brigita, how about you in working with grief? Where did you start and what did disappearing evoke for you?
So we started in a very similar way. We did start in a very similar way, that we had a series of really wonderful conversations that I think instigated the work for both of us in different ways. And at first, because most of my practice is about our relationship to language, I originally came up with this idea of the disappearing Aboriginal language and then this revival of it as well. And I thought, oh, that might be an interesting topic to start with. I'd be fascinated to work on that. But Greg sort of challenged me and came up with this other idea, and which offered, I think, a much more poignant connection for me personally as well. And he raised the photographic work of Olegas Trukanas and also Peter Dombrovskis, who are both from the Baltic countries, which is my heritage. My parents are Latvian, and both Trukanas and also Dombrovskis were refugees as a result of World War II, and so were my parents. And I just found it, I think, I was sort of like bowled over by that extraordinary connection between these tiny countries in the Northern Hemisphere and then this equally small state of Tasmania, this island, and that interconnection there. And that those men who were amazing photographers, probably the best landscape photographers that we know in Tasmania, had captured, you know, this absolutely amazing landscape here, and in particular the disappearing elements of it as well, with Lake Pedder, etc. So that seemed a really great starting point in a way that directed the project through a relationship to place, through a relationship to the land, and the work of these amazing photographers. And we also, I think, agreed that, it was the landscape that offered this great connection for anyone who is in Tasmania, whether you're born here or whatever, that there is this wonderful thing about the landscape and the way people engage with it. So I was really struck by, we went off on our separate ways. We said, oh, let's go and do whatever we want to do with this. And I was really struck by and very inspired by a particular quote from Olegas Trukanas, which is, this vanishing world is beautiful beyond our dreams. And then I can't remember the rest of the quote. It's something about how anything man-made and so on cannot replace the beauty of nature and our engagement with it. So that became the starting point, because I like to start and work with words, and they've been incorporated into a print and into the video. And then Greg came up with some fantastic words.
You had the stage left. So how did you respond to the whole idea of disappearing? And your piece of work is, everyone hopefully has read it, it's like quite different. Many of the other pieces you can read. Yours are juxtaposed pieces. How did you respond to disappearing?
I'll pick up on follow on from what Brigita was saying first before I talk about that text. I've spent maybe the first half of my life trying to work out what it is to be a Tasmanian Aboriginal person in the 21st century. And, well, the first half of my life in the 20th century. And I'm well into the second half of my life trying to work out what it is to be a person in Tasmania in spite of that, in spite of being Aboriginal. And what I mean by that is that so much of the constructs of cultural identity, of connection to place and history, and the meaning that we derive from colonial history is contingent on a whole bunch of things that aren't me. They're contingent on victimhood, they're contingent on, even on survival, because to be a survivor begs the question, you're surviving what? So your identity is derived from something else. So I'm quite absorbed with searching for some intrinsic identity as somebody who calls this place home, and I happen to have a part of my family that has a ridiculously long association with this island. But over the last decade or so, I've made some journeys to two other places where parts of my family have come from. The valley of the Nectar River in Baden-Württemberg in Bavaria, where I was struck by the landscape, which is terraced with these ancient stone walls, and these are terraced vineyards, and they date back to the Holy Roman Empire. And I realised as I was travelling on the train up the Rhine Valley that this was a valley that had just been trodden flat by millennia of warring people, and I came back from that experience just really thoroughly disinterested with spending much more time being submerged by colonial conflict, and instead I've wanted to. This is the longest introductory spiel to a response to a question you're ever going to hear. Yeah. The introductions to stories are often much more interesting than the stories themselves. I'm much more interested in what underlies these constructs of identity that the world imposes on us when we're trying to work out who we are. so that's what really led me to respond to Brigita the way that I did, because I wanted to know kind of who she was in terms of where she'd come from first, because that's what I brought as the Aboriginal participant in the collaboration. And having kind of gotten that out of the way, then work out, well, what are the common human, the really deep, what are the dimensions where the passion comes from that we both are enthralled by? And I quickly discovered that, of course, we were both enthralled by the photography of Dombrovskis and Trukanas. And that was about a disappearing world. It was about the fear of wilderness disappearing. And then the conversation about language, I felt like I was heading back down the rabbit hole that I climbed out of. And instead what I wanted was to respond to that positively by saying, yes, let's use some words from Aboriginal people, but let's use words from Aboriginal people that are in English, that speak to in a common language, just to try and underline that desire to try and understand these others, these figures, these historical figures, as something more than just something people from the past, but actually people who live and breathe in the same air and the same places that we live today. So that's where the text came from.
It's beautifully disconcerting, actually, Grant, because when I read it, I wasn't sure how to read it. Now I know how to read it. I'll read it again, because I wasn't. It's a lovely explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well I responded to your question.
Yeah.
But it's an assemblage of not just words from a number of authors, Aboriginal authors who wrote Australia's first Aboriginal journal, Australia's first Aboriginal newspaper. It was being handwritten and published at Waibelena and Flinders Island in the 1830s. But they were talking from permanent offshore detention. Yeah, which is what Australian administration still want to do with people that they don't want around. So it was also speaking to how some things haven't changed, haven't disappeared as well.
It's lovely. So Leigh and Neil, you're on notice now. There's a different interpretation with Neil's work and Leigh's here. Neil, do you want to say something? How did you come to disappearing, and what did it? Where did you and Leigh start the conversation?
We started the conversation actually in a way that really surprised me, which was Leigh gave me a document to read, and the document, I'll get the title wrongly, so you'll need to remind me, was the City of Hobart's planning scheme.
Building heights. Review project.
There you go.
I'm sure you're excited.
Right. And so Leigh handed me this document as a result of a bit of conversation, and I wasn't initially sure that I'd find it to be a compelling read, because of where I come from, where my interests are. But in all seriousness, I couldn't have been more wrong. And it was a revelation to me. Why? Because I'm used to painting views of landscapes and place and trying to understand my associations, my feelings about belonging to place, being a migrant to this place, through the format of landscape painting and pastiching together colonial era views of this place. And that's how I might try and understand how I come to be here and how I feel about it. But I always do that through these kind of compartmentalised views, this kind of picture. And what Leigh's document revealed to me was something which I possibly knew innately but had never actually thought about explicitly, was that our sense of being in a place, and therefore everything that derives from that, whether it's painting pictures or planning an urban environment, is founded on a much more holistic view of being in that place, which takes in not just compartmentalised views, but also topographies and edges and movements through an environment. I was absolutely enthralled by Leigh's work. If you don't think it's a compelling read, I'd say no, go and read it, because it's great work. And so there you go, that's sort of how I came to it.
Thanks, it's great that someone's read it and appreciates it. Neil was underway with this piece when we got underway together, and this to me is both familiar but also part of that bigger sense of setting that I've been striving for decades to ensure is incorporated into the documents that actually assist how we might live here through the way we develop here. And this work also, to me, is from a deep tradition of picturesque tradition. And it instantly occurred to me that I just instantly was reminded of the Nicholas Pevsner statement that townscape is a word founded on the pattern of landscape. And just so that this doesn't take too long, but the thing that seems really important is that townscape isn't lost in terms of its deeper understanding, both of its origins but also of its meanings, which are to do with it's to do with the scape, not the town. It's to do with the setting, not the built form. It's to do with the structural form of the location in which we live, we share, and the landscapes we share. And just in terms of disappearing, it had been removed as a concept from the previous planning scheme. Townscape had disappeared. You'll be happy to know that through my efforts and convincing others, it's now back in the planning scheme with a broader definition. And that's partly why the statement is about reviewing disappearing townscape. And also, there is a component that we collaborated on, which is the acrylic screen, which should be aligned with Kinani on this axis.
That's right, we had to remove it for tonight. Yeah,
no, that's okay.
Yeah.
But this also speaks to Neil's deep appreciation of what it means to view. And I think that's something that we can continue to discuss.
And this is something I'll ask a few of you to bounce off each other if you need to, but Michaye, just to kick off with you, did you find anything surprising through the collaboration that took you to somewhere that you hadn't expected around disappearing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the really great joys of working with somebody who's a completely different art form to yourself is that you get to see how a whole nother process evolves, and there's similarities and there's differences in that. To watch Heather working with words, and we'd have this sort of conversation, and for Heather it just felt like, or this is my sense of it, that words were you were like a magnet to words. They just kind of come to you, and it's sort of one word leads to another word, and two are sort of swimming in this pool of words, and you're effortlessly stretching one end to the other, and I'm kind of, but I sort of have quite a different process where words and all of that kind of conversation is really rich and an exciting way to start. But for me, the words are they dissipate, they kind of dissolve and fall away. So it was really just, that joy of seeing another process. But I think what we have in common is this really kind of loose association with what we say we're going to do. I really kind of, very presumptuously thought, I think I know what Heather's going to write now, which is completely not. And I love that because that is the surprise that a process creates. You never know what you're going to make. And it would be kind of boring if you did, really. So, there was that joy of the shared experience But, you know, there was some fairly poignant things to take away from our conversations. Some beautiful things.
What sort, Your piece of writing ends in an interesting place, as many of these do. The Heather?
Well, I think what Michaye says about that whole, you know, there was definitely a sort of uprising of ideas and words, and we did look at all sorts of words and their original meanings and how to respond to this sense of potential loss and real loss that we've observed in our lifetimes in Tasmania, and how that will worsen, you know, in the next 50 years. It could worsen irrevocably for generations and generations, given fish farms and things like that. So, you know, we did feel we had to be deeply responsible. Like we started out being quite serious.
Yeah. We're having serious fun.
Very serious, And then I loved what you said just then, because it was as if once you started painting, this sort of silence descended on us. And Michaye was doing images, and I'm trying to get down through all those words and all those ideas to what's the simplest thing I could do, because there's such a magnificent simplicity to Michaye's work that is born of such a depth of experience and skill as well. And I was like, wow, how on earth do I meet that? And so it was a real distillation down into a kind of silence. And then I was like, oh, that's the same silence I have when I'm out at sea, hitting the water. And that's what really flashed up that feeling of, okay, that's the thing I need to talk about here. Because, you know, it horrified me that the Derwent was closed for 4 times during the summer before last. The Kingston Beach had four closures with, you know, bloody signs on the beaches saying, sorry, it's polluted today. And it so outraged me that we've just let it go in 100 years of having, you know, Near Star up the river and everything else we've done to it. We've let it go, and it's as if, oh, it's really big, it'll be fine. But it isn't fine. And the sewage works, which is actually a major problem we have to deal with in the city.
Brigita, how about for you and Greg? What did you discover that did anything in this surprise you?
Gosh, it's kind of a tricky question in some ways.
Good.
I think I've never done landscape. I've never sort of really worked with landscape, and suddenly I was looking at all of these images. You know, I'm familiar with the photography of Truchinus and also Dombrovskis, but I didn't really sort of want to use that work for all kinds of reasons because it's just too much in the recent past. So I started looking at works that were created much earlier, and I was very drawn to the work of Piggany, William Charles Piggany, and so that seemed, I don't know, a total surprise to me that I was going to put landscape in a work.
Is your work a story of hope or loss, or both, somehow?
Well, I'll step one thing back. There are 2 prints. One that focuses on what I was doing with Piggany and with the words of Truchinus. And then another one where Greg chose images, and I worked with those, colonial images that show Aboriginal people. And then his text, his chosen text as well, that I merged over that. But I think what happens, I think, here in the video is that they're all merged together. It's a coming together of those 2 different visions and cultures and of the 2 different texts. And I hope that there's a sense of hope within there, but also some reference to the difficulties and challenges of, you know, Tasmania's past, brutal past as well. I think there are elements of that in it. I hope it's a little bit of all of that in some ways.
Greg, you're nodding. Yeah, so...
brutal past. If everyone thinks about the photographs, the work of the photographers that we were talking about before, in many ways they give us the visual definition of wilderness. You know, Tasmanian wilderness, people are going to think of a photograph by one of these two guys. But there's some brutality in that, because those images are all without people. And the Piggany landscapes, and he's one of my favourite Tasmanian landscape painters, maybe my favourite earliest Tasmanian landscape painter. Because I think he had a vision, a preternatural vision of what we now embrace as the idea of wilderness. But his landscapes are also empty. And when you start to look at colonial landscapes by people, and just bracket off Glover for a minute, sorry Neil, by people like Joseph Lycett and George Evans and others, those very early scenes of colonial landscapes, they don't have any Aboriginal people in them either. Even though those very artists were creating very similar scenes in New South Wales, most of which were populated with Aboriginal figures in the foreground as markers of place and as evidence that the colony was so successful that the natives had been domesticated and they weren't of any harm to anyone. And that's a hint as to why they were missing from the 1820s Van Diemen's Land landscapes, because Aboriginal people here hadn't been domesticated. There was a thing going on called the Black War, which generated the most terrible response from the colonial administration here, which did empty the landscape because people were exiled to Flinders Island. And ironically, only then did Glover, who turned up around that time, reinstate the figures of Aboriginal people in the landscape after they'd been bodily removed. So for me, there's some kind of truth-telling, if you like, about wilderness and about landscape and our ideas of the sublime that happens when the overlay of Piggany's on natives happens with the T.G. Gregson and the who else is there? Skinner Proud and Gould. Yeah. Because all of those scenes were painted after Glover, after it was okay to put Aboriginal figures back in the landscape. So there's a disappearing and a reinscription, but it's a melancholy memorial reinscription that happens. And that's pretty serious. That's a pretty serious dimension of our visual archive and our visual heritage, which I think we managed to do something with.
Yeah. I'll just add one little comment. I got this is from, it was on social media because I put the images up on social media, and one person who was a student at the art school said that they were so moved by the images that you chose and that particular print that they almost cried. They sat there for a while taking in the words. So I found that really quite moving to get that response.
Perhaps what we might do is happy to take some questions from the audience. If you just pop your hand up, I'll spot you. I might know some names, but otherwise I'll just point like an auction. Anyone have any questions for any of the collaborators?
Can't leave unless somebody asks.
Yeah, that's right. We right? Because I've got some. But if you want to butt in, because I will keep going, but I just thought I'll give you a chance. Have you got one? Go on. Oh, I thought there was a question. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
Just
yeah. And speak up loud because the acoustics will be hard.
A recent observation. Mary and I have just spent a couple of weeks plus in the southwest walking, and this taps into something Heather said earlier on about insects, and also that ongoing the disappearing, and there wasn't a single place that we camped or sat down for a cup of tea or a rest or whatever where there wasn't a European wasp often in numbers, turn up. Not a single place. And then one place we sat, we arrived at, and there was this big green caterpillar, I don't know what it was, and it was being attacked by European wasps. It had 4 or 5 of them stuck in, stinging it. Rescued it, it was probably futile. And then it just struck me that there was another disappearing going on. Are those introductions from Europe, by us, doing, again, to clearing the landscape of the smaller critters? There's just another disappearing. So I would raise that.
Neil, I want to ask you this because it's your collaboration, like it's the now and the. What's your sense in that comment and the relationship between the various scapes? Do you see it as a story of hope or of melancholy and disappearing?
Well, I think in the first instance it's the latter, which is that there is a melancholy here, which is that the colonial view is a view that's still, which continues, and it's a view which obscures, and it's a view which doesn't reveal much about place. If I'm being really pessimistic about it, compared to cultures which have been here for so long, whose understanding about how to think about the relationship to land and to place and then how to picture it is profoundly different to the Western version of it. So I'm pessimistic about that, and hence my painting of Konanyi, because, of course, as we all know, Konanyi is continually under threat from various schemes to obscure it, to put something on it. So there's a melancholy there and there's a pessimism there, because I kind of also like those images. That's my heritage. So I'm a bit like the European wasp, turning up and wanting to get stuck in. That's kind of, I am part of that as well. So, but my hope is that by, I suppose, in some small measure, because art really is just a small measure in the scheme of what we're talking about, if you offer a question, if you offer a provocation, if you offer an alternative view, that it simply raises this point. How are we viewing? What are we not seeing? What are we obscuring? And so on. So there's a hopeful gesture there, recognising that I think we're still in the throes of a particular way of viewing the land, which is ultimately not helpful.
Leigh, what's your...
And in that context, terminology and words become very important. And the terminology that's on the acrylic board are terms that I've been generating and using to not describe, but to inform, to provide greater form to the location. And those terms are now embedded in the desired future character statements within the planning scheme, just out of interest. But they become the means by which our location is described by my sense of being here rather than the form the city's taken. Because that tends to be the form of the built rather than the form of the land, which generates the horizons, which generates the relationships between land and water, which become the very basis of the shared landscape of this city, this region and this state. So just another use of the importance of terminology and words.
And Greg, when we first talked about having this event, we said you must be here. And it was for a voice. When you look at this as a whole, this exhibition as a whole, this concept as a whole, how do you feel? What do you think? And how do you respond as an Indigenous person?
It makes me. First of all, it's an unbearable burden to be the only voice in the room 2,000 generations of Tasmanian experience and history, the vast majority of which has been silenced and disappeared in order to make way for what we've got and what we take for granted every day. And there's sadness with that as well, and that's a perpetual experience in any kind of creative outing or public conversation that I'm involved with. So in some ways it's not a lot of fun. But the nourishment comes, and the ability to keep doing that comes from finding some hope in amongst all the disappearing. And the assemblage of text there is maybe a good example of some fairly dark and desperate words from those people who were being held at Waipolena, of profound political and cultural deception. We made an agreement and we have not lost this from our minds, and we have made our part of it good. It's an incredibly profound deceit that was carried out. To the almost inane, they shot our dogs in front of us.
Yeah.
And then on the same page, there's some paraphrasing of T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton, and what draws me to that particular verse is this beautiful phrase, "Other echoes inhabit the garden," which is just a little glimpse of beauty in amongst our modern traumas and our modern dilemmas. And there's also some Dante in there as well, because no meal is complete without a little Dante to spice it up. Probably haven't got time to talk about that. But there's a bit of Tasmania in the Divine Comedy. Disturbingly familiar place. It's an island in the southern hemisphere where the seasons are back to front. How did this guy imagine this place where the traumas of purgatory are played out? He was envisaging a future Tasmania.
Leigh, and we'll gradually creep along the group. What's in looking at all, not just your work in collaboration with Neil, but everyone's work, what's your hope for the future?
That we have an appreciation not just of our locations that are also considered to be well managed and humane, because without that our wild nature is threatened. And if our settlements, particularly our cities, but all settlements, which in this state there is no state settlement policy, surprisingly, Canberra Agreement. But anyway, irrespective of individual developments, we really have such a lot to do, and the way in which we actually describe where we are is fundamental to that.
Heather, what's your hope as you look forward?
That we wake up, that we do, I remember going down to see Bruce Pascoe talk at Signet a few months ago. I don't know if anyone else was there. And it was amazing, hey? And Bruce Pascoe and a number of other Aboriginal people were there, and they talked about taking care of our forests through, the way that when we look at how Indigenous forest management was enacted in Tasmania, and especially around the city of Hobart, because of the art that still exists to show us that, we used to have enormous gum trees, but there'd be 3 per hectare, and their crowns didn't touch, so then a fire couldn't run through them at speed, and you could never have these enormous burns that we now have across the landscape. And But how on earth do we start to look differently? It's like what you said, Neil. How do we get out of a colonial consciousness into a consciousness that says this land is incredibly precious. It's so rare what we have here. You know, it's never been more obvious than in the last year how rare Tasmania is. And yet, how is it that we still allow right now fish farms all the way through the Narrows and out across White Beach and into all these fish sanctuaries and fish gestation places? You know, like we are losing our fish, we are losing, and then it gets celebrated that we have 50,000 salmon running wild because the net broke. And yes, it's fun for those of us who catch one, but it's not fun for all the other creatures that have to deal with that infestation, which is no different to wasps. So, you know, we need to wake up. And we need to stop looking at the world as colonials, but look at it as if it's our responsibility. So I'm not very hopeful we're going to do that, but I'll do what I can to try and wake us up.
Brigita.
Gosh, it's another tough question, really. I think it's to do with waking up as well. I really think we have to stop being complacent and also complicit with the status quo. It's so easy just to go along with the way things are. That's the easiest way to do things. And I think we really have to, and I'm going to quote another artwork that I have on in the city at the moment, we need to raise up our voices and really speak up about things to save, to make things better, to make this a better place before it is destroyed and vanishes.
I think I hope, and this might sound a bit dippy, but I just hope we can all kind of learn to love a little deeper, whether that's each other, whether that's our place that we're inhabiting, that we don't just, that you know, in a way the melancholy that Neil was mentioning is almost, there's some hope in that too. It's an active engagement, even though it's a sadness. It's still participating in a conversation. It's still keeping it open. And so I hope we don't come to a conclusion tonight. I want to see the conversation continue. So that's my hope, really, is that, you know, for the next generations coming on, that we learn to listen, that we learn to cooperate, that we converse, and that we, you know, learn to appreciate too. I mean, this, you know, like Heather and I had a conversation once about humanity disappearing, which, you know, is obviously a very deeply depressing thought, but at the same time there is lightness in that. There is the hope that we might appreciate what we have a little deeper.
Because we're the biggest invasive species on the planet. Yeah.
We're passing through. This is a moment. It's like looking in a mirror. You have the reality and you have your reflection, and you're just passing through, like on a path. So we mustn't make the most of it. Yeah.
Neil.
In the COVID times, me and my partner went for lots of walks, you know, long hikes, multi-day hikes, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the lack of other people around me. The pressures of tourism had been removed momentarily, and stuff was revealed to me in a way that it hadn't been revealed to me before, and I came to understand and appreciate being in an environment in a way that I hadn't had before. Am I sounding like I'm hoping the COVID times continue? I didn't mean to go there, but I guess it's a simple statement. I hope that we reveal more than we conceal or obscure. I guess that's it. That's how I'd sum that up.
Thank you. I think that brings us to a close. We'll be here for a little while, obviously, and so I'm speaking on behalf of the fellow panellists here, but approach them and discuss and explore and continue the conversation. And so I'd just like to first of all thank the panellists, Greg and Leigh, Heather, Brigita, Michaye and Neil. Thank you for tonight and your wonderful work. And a special thanks to my Rap Bay collaborator, Peter Hay.
Yeah.
Yep. And a big thank you to Carol Bett and the whole team at the Bett Gallery. Your Poets and Painters exhibitions are not just beautiful, but they're profound. And hopefully we've made a little ripple in the universe with what's happened so far with this. But thank you very much to the gallery. So well done.